Welcome back for some more Seattle Kraken expansion draft speculation, and if you have been watching this series up to this point, you'll know that I've been largely focusing on more younger, or at least not the older players. Because in large part, although I have mentioned a couple of names of guys that are a little bit farther on in their careers, when it comes to Seattle, I do think that one of the things they'll be looking for is guys that can at least provide a few years of service for them, or at the very least have the potential to. But when it comes to a team like the Dallas Stars, who we're going to be talking about today, when it comes to their expansion draft outlook, the players that could be available for Seattle definitely are trending towards the more experienced end of the spectrum. But that definitely doesn't mean that Seattle isn't going to be in line to get a good player from this team. So let's see what the Stars have to offer. Real quick though, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, that subscribe button down there, it can probably help you out. For the Stars, they are coming off of a season last year that saw them eventually make a run all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals in the playoff bubble. And then, at least coming into this current season, which does look pretty different thanks to COVID, they found themselves in a new division that appeared to be pretty top-heavy, because, while it did include the team that sent them home packing from the Stanley Cup Finals and ended up going home with the Cup in the Tampa Bay Lightning, it also included a number of teams that wouldn't have normally made the playoffs in a normal year. However, as we near the half point in the season, if there's one team outside of maybe the Buffalo Sabres that has had the hardest go of things so far, it might be the Stars. Thanks to a couple of COVID outbreaks and the blizzard that hit Texas particularly hard, the Stars more than anything else have just had a hard time getting things rolling this season so far. And while as a result they have played the fewest games in their division, which will give them some time to maybe catch up some of that ground that they've lost, currently as things stand, the only team that they're above in their division is the Red Wings. All of which is to say that even outside of the number of unrestricted veteran free agents that the Stars will have at the end of this season, it could be interesting to see where this team thinks they are come the trade deadline, and whether they decide to be buyers or sellers there. So by the time the expansion draft rolls around, this roster could look fairly different in a couple of places than how it looks currently. However, I'm not sure exactly how much it's going to change in the places that the Kraken are most likely to be looking. And that's due in part to the fact that even if the Stars were to want to make some trades, even with the players that aren't going to be unrestricted free agents at the end of the year, they do have a number of no movement clauses that they're going to have to figure their way around. And those no movement clauses could also definitely affect who they're able to protect, because as we start on the forward end, there are 3 of them here. Those belonging to Tyler Seguin, Jamie Benn, and Alexander Radulov. Now, as all 3 of those guys are probably players they would end up protecting anyway, I'm not sure exactly how much it would end up mattering, but it definitely does limit their options a little bit. Aside from them though, Radek Faksa, Roope Hintz, and Denis Gurianov I think are also all pretty likely to end up protected. So then the question just comes down to who ends up filling that last spot. It probably comes down to either Joe Pavelski or Jason Dickinson. And honestly, at this point, I really could see this one going either way, and we will talk about both players. But at least for the purposes of this video right now, I'm gonna lean a little bit more towards Jason Dickinson getting that last spot. And when it comes to that decision between Pavelski and Dickinson, to this point in the season, Pavelski has gotten off to a very strong start, especially considering his, at least by his standards, below average season last year. But with that being said, Pavelski is also just a few months removed from being 37 years old, and is currently commanding $7 million a year through next season. So then even assuming that Pavelski does continue the pace that he's currently on so far to this point in the season, when it comes to the decision for the Stars of whether or not to protect him, they probably only do if they think that they still have a championship window open for the next couple of years. Again, considering how this season has started for them, might seem a little bit less likely than it did coming into the season. Meanwhile, with Dickinson, even though he's nowhere near the points producer that Pavelski is, and that probably isn't going to be changing anytime soon, he still is a pretty decent defensive forward. And on top of that, for the Stars' cap purposes anyway, even though he is set to be an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season, he's not going to be commanding anywhere near the amount of money that Pavelski does. Plus, he is also 12 years younger, so if the Stars come to the conclusion that they probably aren't looking at a Stanley Cup in the next couple of years, then they'll probably lean more towards protecting the younger guy. Thankfully though, for Dallas GM Jim Nill on the defensive end for the Stars, things are much easier to figure out here. And that's because, at least as things stand right now, it would be a pretty big surprise if those 3 protection spots did not go to Esa Lindell, John Klingberg, and Miro Heiskanen, with the only of those 3 not currently under contract for next year being Heiskanen, but he is certainly going to be getting re-signed at some point by the Stars, which is part of the reason they need more cap space. And then when it comes to the question of who the protected goaltender will be for the Stars, well, the short answer is Ben Bishop has a no movement clause, but he is still set to be out until sometime in April as he recovers from an injury that he suffered towards the end of last season, which is also what allowed Anton Khudobin to become the Stars' playoff hero last season, and also has allowed him to get some significant starting time to this point in the current year. So while I won't say that it's completely out of the question that Khudobin could, with his play, end up forcing the Stars to at least ask Bishop whether or not he would waive his no movement clause, I do think it's pretty hard to say that Khudobin would end up protected. So then, as it comes to the players that could be available for the Kraken to select from, and more importantly, the ones that I could actually see the Kraken taking, there aren't a whole ton of options when it comes to the Stars. And that's mostly because at least a few of these guys that we're going to be talking about will be available for the Kraken to pick, and I really don't see anybody else that would be a more intriguing option than one of these guys. On the forward end, the best option comes down to which one of Pavelski or Dickinson ends up not protected. And since I did say that I thought Dickinson was more likely to be protected, just by a little bit anyway at this point, we'll start with Joe Pavelski. Having spent the first 13 years of his now 15-year career in the NHL in San Jose with the Sharks, Pavelski has now played in over 1,000 games, where he has 815 points on 381 goals and 434 assists. And really throughout his entire career, he's been a pretty consistent player when it comes to goal scoring, always near a point per game, but never quite getting there. Though, of course, like I mentioned earlier, last year, which was his first in Dallas, didn't go particularly well from a points production standpoint, as he only had 31 in 67 games, with 14 of those being goals. But again, at least so far to this point in the season, he has definitely bounced back with 23 points in 20 games, which does put him well on pace to have his best, at least from a points per game standpoint, points production of any year in his career. But more than just being a consistent points producer, Pavelski has also been a very solid two-way forward throughout the course of his career, always somewhere near the top of the league as far as forwards are concerned in block shots. But even beyond block shots and hits, which for a forward he also has had a few seasons with a healthy number of, this definitely shows up in his advanced stats, where he has a career 54.5 Corsi for percentage, and outside of last season where he had a 51.7, has never been below 52%. Again, with 50 being the benchmark for an average player. And of course, at least in the portion of his career in which it's been recorded so far to this point, he also looks pretty good in that expected plus-minus category as well. Now, like I said in the opening, I haven't talked about a whole lot of players throughout the course of this series to this point anyway, that have the same amount of NHL, or let's call it life experience as Pavelski has. And there is a very good reason for that, but there's also a very good reason that I'm talking about Pavelski now. And that's because even outside of the fact that Pavelski once again is a proven consistent points producer as well as a strong two-way forward, which, as far as forwards are concerned in the expansion draft, the Kraken aren't likely to see a whole lot of, he also can offer something else that a team like the Kraken could desperately need in the form of leadership. Because if this roster does turn out to be a lot of younger or players somewhere in the middle of their career that are all obviously going to be coming from different backgrounds and different teams, then his experience as a captain for the San Jose Sharks for a long period of time could definitely prove to be useful for Seattle. And while sure, him being nearly 37 years old would once again probably suggest that he wouldn't be in Seattle for a particularly long period of time, it could still be a very significant one. And while that contract that will earn him $7 million next year could prove to be a liability for the Stars, it probably wouldn't be for the Kraken, if not an asset for them. Because again, as we go through these, even with a number of players that will still be re-signing contracts, you still do have to keep in mind that the Kraken have a couple of benchmarks that they have to meet when it comes to, one, drafting players that are going to be under contract for their first season, and two, drafting players that add up to a certain amount of salary. Both things that Pavelski in his contract could certainly help with, and even if it turns out that Seattle does draft him and he doesn't really prove to be worth $7 million in his first year with them, that contract does expire at the end of 2022, so they really aren't tied to him long term. Of course, again, especially considering the production that he has been able to have for the Stars so far to this point in the season, Pavelski could still very well end up being protected by the team, in which case Dickinson is probably the most likely to end up off of that list. And if that were to be the case, then he would probably become the most intriguing forward that the Stars have to offer. The 25-year-old center, who was a former first-round pick, has played in 6 different NHL seasons, or at least part of them anyway, with only 1 game in his first season. In that time, he's put up 55 points in 190 games on 22 goals and 33 assists. So again, obviously not quite the points producer that Pavelski is, but over the last 3 years, which does include this current season, he has been somewhere around a point every 3 games type of player. But like Pavelski, he is also a pretty decent two-way forward, and while this doesn't necessarily show up in his advanced stats in quite the same way that it does for his more experienced counterpart, he has, over the last few years anyway, been able to block quite a number of shots, plus becoming a fairly physical type of forward with the number of hits that he's been able to accrue. All of which would suggest that if he were taken by Seattle, it's probably not super likely that he would slot into a top 6 forward type of role, but he could do pretty well on a third line for Seattle. Beyond these two, really the only other guy on the forward end that I could even see the Kraken considering would be Blake Como. But while with 868 games in 15 seasons, he has roughly the same amount of experience that Pavelski does, he is nowhere near the same player that Pavelski is. I mean, don't get me wrong, you don't have a 15-year career in the NHL for nothing, but for Como, it definitely doesn't have as much to do with his points production or puck possession skills, and has a lot more to do with the fact that he is a very physical type of forward. But ultimately with him, it just comes down to the fact that, one, I don't even know if the Stars are going to re-sign him, and two, there are just going to be better options for the Kraken to pick from. One such option on the defensive end is Jamie Oleksiak. At 28 years old, Oleksiak has played in at least part of 9 different NHL seasons, playing at least part, if not all of those seasons, in Dallas, although he did take a little bit of a break going to Pittsburgh for 2 half seasons before coming back to Dallas. In that time, he's played in 333 games with 61 points on 20 goals and 41 assists. So he really isn't that much of a points producer, and at least for a defenseman anyway, his block shots really aren't all that impressive either. But ever since his time in Pittsburgh, he has become a very physical player on the defensive end, with more than 2 hits per game. And then when it comes to his advanced stats, really throughout the entire course of his career, he's done well to at least contribute to an average to above average puck possession, as well as having a career expected plus minus of 9.2, and last season in 69 games really shined with an expected plus minus of 7.5. So with Oleksiak, while he's certainly not really a standout player in any specific way, he is a very solid defenseman, which the Kraken could definitely use. And while like Dickinson on the forward end, he probably wouldn't slot into a top pair type of role, he certainly could add a good amount of physicality to the Kraken's back end. The only other real option I could maybe see on the defensive end would be Mark Pysyk. At 29 years old, Pysyk has played a little bit more time in the NHL, having played in 435 games across 9 different NHL seasons, with 89 points on 23 goals and 66 assists in that time. So he does have a little bit more experience and is a little bit more of a points producer than Oleksiak is, but not really significantly so in either way. Although he did score a career-high 18 points, including 9 goals and a hat trick against the Leafs last year, but this year so far only has 1 point on 1 goal in 18 games. But beyond that, when it comes to his advanced stats, and certainly when it comes to physicality, at least as far as hits are concerned, he definitely does not quite measure up to Oleksiak. Really, the only place that you could make an argument that he has substantially better looking stats than Oleksiak does would be with his block shots. But outside of a 3-year span between 2016 and 2019, he really has not necessarily continued to excel there either. Ultimately with him though, I really just don't see him being a particularly likely option for the Kraken to be picking from the Stars. Again, mostly because I just think Oleksiak is going to be the better option for them here on the defensive end if that is where they choose to pick from. But even with that said, there still is one more player on the Stars that could offer a pretty intriguing option for the Kraken to look at, and it might even be the player that most people have been talking about to this point, that being Anton Khudobin. Soon to be 35 years old, Khudobin has played at least 1 game in 12 different NHL seasons, with at least a little bit more significant playing time in 8 of those. In that time, he's started 210 of the 230 games he's played in, with 103 wins to 83 losses in his career and a save percentage of .919, and a goals against average of 2.46. For the majority of his career, he has served as a backup goaltender, getting his most playing experience in Carolina, where he played in 30-plus games both seasons, and now in Dallas, where he's had fairly significant playing time behind Bishop with his injury issues. And he has looked very good during his time in Dallas, at least when he's gotten in front of the net anyway, with a .923 save percentage in the 2018-19 season, and then a league-leading .930 save percentage last year, which again led to that playoff run. And while it does have to be said that while that has happened in front of one of the league's better defenses in Dallas, and that this year, as he has started to see some more playing time as Bishop still remains on the injured reserve list, his save percentage has dropped, he still could offer a very good experienced option for the Kraken. So ultimately with him, I don't necessarily think that the question is whether or not he could offer a good option for the Kraken to pick. The question becomes whether or not Seattle can find some better options elsewhere, because once again, goalie is going to be the most saturated when it comes to talent of the positions the Kraken will be picking. And especially when it comes to a team like Dallas, who could be offering a fairly decent forward option, which again is going to be the position that is going to be most sparse when it comes to good options in the expansion draft. Plus, at the age of 34, even if that forward option is Pavelski, it's not like Khudobin would be offering too much more in the way of years of service going forward. And on top of that, although he has been a very good backup for the majority of his career, he hasn't seen a whole lot of starting time as the primary goalie for a team, so especially if the Kraken were looking to go more the route of having a young goaltender in that backup role, like maybe Adin Hill from Arizona, to learn behind more of an experienced veteran. And if they were going to go that way, you might think that they would probably pick a veteran with a little bit more as far as starting experience is concerned. So ultimately, if it were up to me to pick a player from Dallas, at least at this point in time anyway, I would probably end up taking whichever one of those two forwards would end up being available between Pavelski and Dickinson. And honestly, especially considering the number of goalies that will be available across the league, I'd probably even take Alexiak over Khudobin, but that might be a bit of a harder decision. As far as maybe potential side deals are concerned with Dallas, honestly, I don't see a whole lot of reason for either side to really go out of their way to make something happen here, so I would say it's pretty unlikely that anything happens in that venue between these two teams. But that will bring us to the end of this one, so if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Plus, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Stars and who you think they'll protect, or who you'd like to see Seattle take down in the comments section. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.